Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is one of the most beloved films of all time, a cinematic classic that celebrates everything chocolate and candy related. It's also ostensibly a weird film, and how it ends is really interesting to me. Charlie gets the factory and he gets into an elevator made of glass with Willy Wonka and his grandpa. And his reward for doing this? They shoot off into space, and that's where the movie and the book end. Isn't it interesting to think about what would have happened next and the adventure that comes after it? Well, luckily for us, author Roald Dahl did make a sequel to the book, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. And that's what we're here to talk about today. But you might notice something. See, whilst Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, released in 1971, is considered a classic today, back when the film was released, it wasn't terribly well received, and the author Roald Dahl famously disliked the adaptation and refused to allow an adaptation of Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator as a result of this. And I think that is the biggest shame of all time. Because whilst the first book deals with chocolate and the idea of greed and the idea of making sure that you have something, a legacy to pass on to another generation, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, it's a science fantasy book. It's a fantasy fiction set in space. It's an incredible adventure, and one I'd love to talk about today. So let's go through a brief overview of what the book is actually about, before we actually talk about how it could work as a movie. The action begins after Willy Wonka, owner of the famous chocolate factory, has announced that Charlie would inherit the factory upon his retirement. All of Charlie's family came out to the factory and gathered into the Great Glass Elevator to become a part of Charlie's new life. This includes Charlie's grandpa Joe, who was always more than willing to share in Charlie's adventures and had gone through the factory with him. He was a kind and loving man who acted younger than his years. It also included Charlie's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, who were mostly unhappy. Also along for the ride were his three other grandparents, who never got out of bed. They acted older than their years, but they still fit into the huge clear elevator because they were managed to push the bed onto the elevator so that they did not have to leave their bed. So throughout most of this movie, they're enjoying the adventure whilst lying in bed. Sounds like a pro move to me. The elevator was full of buttons that could make it do fantastic things. It took off through the roof of the factory, not attached with any rails or pulleys, and floated by some unseen means. Willy Wonka's plan had been to go so high that he could crash land back into the factory in another spot. However, one of the old ones distracted him, and he did not pull the elevator back in time. This then took them into space, where they encountered a spaceship hotel. This was a huge building floating through space, with all the amenities of a ritzy hotel. It was being attacked by evil aliens, the Vermicious Nids. These creatures could change their shape as if they were made out of clay, and they liked to eat people. Willy Wonka and company outsmarted them, and they saved a spaceship full of hotel employees commuting there. The Nids wound up burning in Earth's atmosphere, becoming little fireballs, almost like shooting stars. During this adventure, the President of the United States watched on from cameras from the spaceship. He was thoroughly confused by the big see-through rectangle with 8 people on board, some of them in their nightshirts. At first, he assumed that they were from an enemy country, or perhaps they worked for Hilton Hotels. Later, he came to the conclusion that Wonka and friends were aliens too. After the hotel commuters were rescued, he figured the people in the elevator were brave astronauts. The President of the United States was surrounded by trusted advisors, although all of them were pretty incompetent. The elevator crash landed back into the chocolate factory. The group found themselves in the chocolate room, where a jungle made out of chocolate filled the room. They were surrounded by Oompa Loompas, who were very small people who helped Wonka in the factory. Since Charlie was going to take over the factory, Wonka assumed that the rest of the family would want to help. Grandpa Joe agreed to help. Charlie's parents were worried, and the old ones still didn't want to leave their bed. Willy Wonka offered them some Wonkavite, a miraculous vitamin that each pill would reduce one's age by 20 years. A year would tick away every second. But the old ones got greedy. They each gulped down 4 pills, and it turned the oldest grandparents into babies. The youngest, for example, Grandma Georgina, was only 78, so she became -2. She disappeared. Wonka asked Charlie if they should go save her, and he said they should. Wonka deferred to Charlie because Charlie was the rightful owner of the chocolate factory, and Charlie said they should risk their lives to help Grandma Georgina, because it was the right thing to do. It was about this point in the book that Wonka gave up some of his control in the situation and let Charlie do what needed to be done. It was like a torch being passed. The two of them get back into the elevator. Wonka and Charlie left the other adults behind to care for the babies with help from the Oompa Loompas. With just the two of them, there was no one to tell them that they could not do things and no one to argue with them. Wonka and Charlie worked really well together.
Wonka sees the elevator to Minus Land, where people go when they have been minused. It was a grey, dreary world of myths. It was inhabited only by people who have been minused. Norlies also lurked here. They were invisible creatures that could turn you into a Norlie with just one bite. Fortunately, they found Grandma Georgina pretty quickly before they encountered any Norlies. She was partially transparent, and Charlie's hand was able to go right through her. Wonka sprayed her with a liquid that would age her, so-called Vita-Wonk. She faded out completely. Wonka said that she would have reappeared in the chocolate room. They headed back, and there she was, back in bed, but she was now more than 300 years old. They had to give her enough Wonkavite to reduce her age again, and got her back to 78. Then Wonka administered the Vita-Wonk to the babies to bring them back to their old ages again. There had been some protesting from Mr. and Mr. Bucket because they were worried about what these chemicals could do, but they were ultimately talked into letting Wonka use them. Then there was much commotion from the Oompa Loompas. A helicopter had landed near the factory. A letter from the President of the United States was brought in. It said that the astronauts who rescued the Space Hotel employees were tracked to the factory. They were all invited to be his guests at the White House. At this, even the old ones jumped out of bed and ran to the helicopter. The parents were excited too, so Charlie, Willy Wonka, and Grandpa Joe happily went off onto their next adventure.
I just think of like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory when I hear the space elevator, you know. But because people sort of manage like an elevator, you press up and you're just like, now you're in space. This is like this is extremely complicated. Yeah, I don't think it's really realistic to have a space elevator.
Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator serves as Roald Dahl's attempt to address two different readers. For children, he tells a fantasy-filled yarn with space aliens, strange world, and even stranger people. For adults, he picks fun at the politicians, lazy people, and people that are either stupid or cowardly. There's a fair bit of moralizing in the book. That's a complicated book, and there's a lot of stuff that happens in there. And of course, it would be remiss of me to not mention the illustrations by Quentin Blake that go throughout the novel as well, and I'll be using most of those throughout this video. So given the absolute length and everything that happens in this novel, I think we need to kind of delve into different aspects of how I want this movie to work. So let's start with the length. Both Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory tend to come out to be about 1.5 hours or nearly 1 hour and 55 minutes. So for Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, I guess we're looking at around a 2-hour runtime, give or take. You probably need about 5 minutes to establish the fact that Charlie had won the factory, all of his family is there, they're getting ready to go into the Great Glass Elevator, and then you need about probably 10 or 15 minutes of the Great Glass Elevator shooting off into space, and then everything that happens after that will probably need to cover the next hour and a half. The introduction sequence could be animated to kind of hint at Minus Land and maybe show off some of the Vinicius Nids as well, and maybe even a shot at the President of the United States working at his desk. Some of these things could be established early on, so that when we show them later on in the film, they at least make sense. So we know how long the film is going to be, let's talk about the themes of the movie and what we want to talk about with our Great Class Elevator movie.
The main problem with space travel is cost. To put you in orbit around the planet Earth costs about $10,000 a pound. Once you're outside the first 100 miles, you coast. You coast all the way out to Pluto. So if the first 100 miles is the only problem, why not have a space elevator where you simply hit the up button and you ascend up a cable into outer space? For a century, we thought that this idea of the space elevator was ridiculous. Now we have a new game changer: carbon nanotubes and graphene.
I think one of the biggest themes that Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator has is the notion of courage. The novel has several scenes that are terrifying and confusing, such as the elevator in space with the Vinicius Nids and the ghastly void of Minus Land. Charlie demonstrates exemplary courage as he faces these situations. He is willing to accompany Wonka into Minus Land to get his grandmother back, even though it is a hellish place. The courage isn't over the top. He's no hero, he just lets his fear and hesitation show, and then the most important thing is that he conquers those fears and shores up his courage to do what is right. Then there's the silliness of adults. Most of Roald Dahl's novels poke fun at adults, and this one is right there up with them. 3 of the grandparents are greedy and cantankerous and make poor choices. The President of the United States and his circle of advisors are idiots. They bluster, they brag, and they're all impotent in their own way. Charlie isn't perfect, but he is a much more level-headed and kind person, and Roald Dahl gives the young readers what they want by depicting the adults in less than flattering ways, both visually and through the novel. Wonka is the only adult who is written favourably, but he too is a bit of a crazy, unpredictable character. Another big theme is family.
I don't have friends. I got family.
Roald Dahl depicts the picture of a perfect family, which consists of totally different personalities, but which is still strong and loving. The members of Charlie's family always support each other, they respect each other's decisions, and never turn their back on somebody if he or she does something wrong. Willy Wonka is almost always spontaneous.
My chocolate! My beautiful chocolate!
Don't just stand there, do something!
Help. Police. Murder.
It's tomato soup. It's hot and creamy. I can actually feel it running down my throat.
Stop.
It's
Don't.
Why doesn't she listen to Mr. Wonka?
Because, Charlie, she's a nitwit.
Look at me. I'm going to be the first person in the world to be sent by television.
Hey, get away from that thing!
Stop. Don't. Come back.
He encourages Charlie to be like this as well, which can be liberating, and there is certainly delight in spontaneity and letting loose, such as the joy of exploring. However, spontaneity is also dangerous because without thinking through some of the possible consequences of their actions, it's possible that they could be eaten by the Vinicius Nids, be blown up by the United States, or lose their grandparents to Minus Land. The final thing to talk about here is the idea of greed. Roald Dahl explores the greed depicted in the characters of the 3 grandparents, and they are punished for this. Wonka claims to hate greed and squabbling, and he certainly engineered what happened to the grandparents to give them their comeuppance. But there's a bit of hypocrisy here, because Willy Wonka is the purveyor of greed-inducing sweets. He tells his Oompa Loompas to do his bidding, takes on a dictatorial role, manipulates people to do what he wants, and is greedy himself. It's a complex character, which is fascinating to both young audiences and older readers as well, and something that I'd love a movie to explore. So, okay, we've talked about the themes, we've talked about some of the things that we hope to get out of this film. Now, there's the cast.
You know, one of the things I love so much about that movie that makes it work for me, which is unlike a lot of children's movies are afraid to have any menace. And Willy Wonka, there's some darkness in that role that you added to the character, and I think that probably scared some moms away when the movie first came out.
It did, because it wasn't a commercial success.
No, which always surprised me when the movie came out. The movie didn't do that well, and I think it was because there's some scariness to it a little bit.
The kids weren't scared.
Right.
The mothers were scared.
Right.
They
on
thought-
behalf of the kids.
On behalf of the kids, but the
Right.
kids knew it was a morality play.
Right.
And where do you draw the line? And they wanted the line drawn.
Right.
The mothers were afraid of it.
Right. And it's interesting, as the kids get older, I think the parents feel okay with them seeing it, and then they realize there's nothing scary about this movie at all.
When going through the tunnel, the psychedelic tunnel, a little bit scary.
Yeah, well, that's where, when I saw that movie for the first time and you're taking the kids through the tunnel and Willy Wonka starts to seem insane to me in a scary way, and I was afraid, but then you learn later on there's a purpose to all of it.
Casting Willy Wonka is probably going to be the hardest part of this process. You have to get an actor that's willing to be spontaneous, energetic, but also mysterious, and a little bit of the dark element that we saw in Gene Wilder's performance. I don't necessarily hate Johnny Depp's portrayal of Willy Wonka, but it just doesn't really do it for me. Randomness and quirkiness is a part of Willy Wonka's character, but it's not the entire part of Willy Wonka's character.
Good morning, Starshine. The Earth says hello.
You need an actor that can kind of do both. Be silly, be serious, be smart, be stupid. Get every element and put it into the one character. So, who is the best actor for this? Let's think about it. I think there's certainly some strong candidates that we can at least talk about. Donald Glover is one of the most dynamic talents working today, particularly as he continues to thrive as a musician. He's capable of being buoyant, introspective, and is just a generally talented dude. I feel like Donald Glover would really be a perfect Willy Wonka for this role, but there are some good alternatives here. Ryan Gosling, of course, is an amazing actor that's been in tons of great movies and was in arguably the biggest reboot and sequel of all time. So I feel like he'd be a good pick for this. He's introspective and can give a lot to a performance just through his facial expressions alone. Another good actor, Adam Driver.
Can I talk to you about something?
I just had sex. I'm about to eat nachos! It's the greatest moment of my life!
I mean, why not? Then you've got Charlie Bucket. Charlie is the emotional heart and soul of the film. He's kind of the audience surrogate. Everything that we see is through Charlie's perspective. And he's the new owner of the factory, so he'd certainly have a bit of confidence about him, and definitely would be the sort of child actor that you'd want to be hypnotised by. So here's a fun fact. When Roald Dahl wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory back in 1964, he actually wrote the main character as a young black boy, and Charlie remained black until Dahl's agent forced him to make Charlie white. The agent apparently said people would ask why he was black. In 2017, Felicity Dahl, Roald Dahl's widow, spoke about this original vision and said it was a pity that each film adaptation so far has featured a white protagonist. When asked what she thought about an adaptation featuring a black hero, she said, "That would be wonderful." So, I think that's that. Once you've cast Charlie and Willy Wonka, everyone else basically falls into place. Charlie's parents don't really matter to the story too much, and they're not really important characters, but you can basically cast anyone into those roles. And for the grandparents, they're generally the comedic characters, so you could just cast 4 British people that are generally funny and considered to be comedy greats and put them all into a bed together. This would be an easy role for them, they wouldn't have to get out of bed for the whole film. I think it's an interesting issue to tackle because once you've got the Charlie's family unit, everything else falls into place.
That now and again, very rarely, you dream into the future. Did you know that?
No.
No, there was a chap called Dunn who wrote a wonderful classic book, it is now, years ago, called An Experiment in Time. And he harnessed about 1,000 undergraduates from Oxford or Cambridge and got them all to write down their dreams the moment they woke up. And they were nearly all based on the past, influenced by the past. Now and again, and he kept in touch with them all, an undergraduate would have dreamt that he was somebody he'd never seen before, getting out of a train, say, at a country station, a station master walking towards him, nothing much happening, blue mountains in the distance, and a year later, he'd suddenly be doing it. You can dream into the future.
If there's one fact I hope I've gotten across through this video essay, it's that Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator is a book full of ideas. It's a sci-fi adventure full of scary monsters, but also the amazingness of and the vastness of space. I feel like this is a film that is just begging to be made and would do incredibly well at the box office with all the creative ideas that we've talked about and at least hinted at during this video essay. And I'm sure all of you have ideas as well, and I'd love to know about them below. All I know is that if we ever do get to see a Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator movie, you can bet that I'm the first one there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Space Cop. I remember the times that we danced and saved the world, and ate hot dogs by the stand. I remember all the things that we did, punching aliens in the veil. There are even babies on the burner. My hero of space. My hero of space. My